Hello, Colorado Realtors. I'm Scott Peterson. Thank you for joining me for another Legal Bites, the fifth in our series on 2022 contract changes. As you guys know, I'm hitting some areas of the contract where I've seen recurring questions on the legal hotline and trying to just do a little bit of education. If you guys want a place to a resource to go to, if you have some of these same questions. So if you haven't seen some of the earlier ones, check through the library, and it may be some good talking points on how to utilize some of these changes that have occurred in 2022. I'm going to talk now about some changes to the earnest money release language in the contract. My friend Monica, who produces all these things, said, oh, you need to make some reference to, Earnest Saves Christmas, or one of these earnest money, or earnest with regard to earnest monies. Earnest returns the money, something like that. And Monica's the same person who in an earlier episode of this was referring to Shogun as like the greatest docu-mini series of all time. And so, you can tell her taste in entertainment leaves a lot to be desired, doesn't it, Monica? She's got a young kid, and she's... Anyhow, earnest money release changes. It's my money, give it to me. This is paragraph 4.3.2. So this change is a good change. I like it a lot. I'm glad they made it. It used to be I'd get calls on the hotline from, often it was a buyer's agent who'd say, my buyer terminated. They had every right to terminate. They did it timely. Everything's good. And the seller is just being a jerk. They're just not signing the earnest money release. What can I do? And I'd say, well, what the contract says is the seller is supposed to sign the earnest money release within 3 days of receiving the earnest money release if the money is due back to the buyer. But that was all it said. It didn't say, and if they don't, there was an encouragement, but there wasn't really a stick associated with that. Didn't have any teeth to it. So I think these changes put a little bit of teeth in with regard to the party who is obligated to return the earnest money. So let me describe what occurred in the contract under 4.3.2. It used to just say that the buyer was entitled to the earnest money back. In other words, if the buyer timely terminated and had a right to terminate, the seller was obligated to return the earnest money. So one of the things that changed in the new contract update was that it added that the buyer similarly. So there's times where the buyer should be signing the earnest money release back to the seller. And so it added another sentence essentially that replicated the old contract that only said if the buyer had a right back to right to have the earnest money returned, that the seller needed to sign it within 3 days or return it within 3 days. There's now a sentence that says if the seller is entitled to the earnest money, then the buyer is supposed to sign within 3 days of receiving an earnest money release form to the seller, right? So it made it mutual, both directions. But then it also did something for both sides that's really sort of important. It tied the party's failure. So in the case that you're the buyer and the seller is failing to return the earnest money to you or sign the earnest money release for you, even though they should, it tied your rights as a buyer to damages now, to paragraph 20 and 21 of the contract. So it gave some teeth to it. So what that means is that a buyer is, if a seller is not performing, they're now entitled to the paragraph 21 remedy for when a seller is in default of the contract, which is specific performance or damages or both, right? And similarly, if a buyer is not signing an earnest money release, going back to the seller is now able to pursue damages against the buyer for that failure to simply sign an earnest money release because the other party is just kind of acting like a jerk and says, I don't want to sign it. So it essentially puts some teeth into that provision. And so now if you're a broker, buyer's agent in my example earlier, and you call the hotline and you say, hey, what do I do? The seller's just being a jerk. They don't want to sign the earnest money release. What do I do? My response is going to be, well, I would remind the listing broker and the seller, and that's just for my example, same thing would be on the other direction, that if the seller doesn't sign the earnest money release, or if the other party doesn't sign the earnest money release, then the buyer in my example is eligible to pursue additional damages. And the other thing that it tied it to is paragraph 21, which is our prevailing party clause in the contract, which means that the buyer could also, if they incur legal fees or court costs or any additional costs associated with litigation or pursuing litigation, then they would also be eligible to obtain those through the prevailing party clause. So the good news is there's a little bit of teeth now if you're on the end representing the client who is fully entitled to the earnest money and the other party is just being a jerk and doesn't want to sign an earnest money release. There's a little bit more teeth in that clause now. Now, last thing I want to mention here is be very clear. If there's a legitimate earnest money dispute, then all of the bets are off, right? Neither party is or is obligated to sign an earnest money release if there is a legitimate earnest money dispute at hand, right? So that's an exception to this earnest money release or disposition of earnest money clause. So be clear on that. This does not obligate a party who has a right to pursue the earnest money and there's a legitimate earnest money dispute to automatically somehow get that money. All right? So that's an important change. I'm glad that the Forms Committee and the Real Estate Commission made that change. I think it makes a lot of sense and hopefully will give a little bit more of a stick to a party who is entitled to get the earnest money back that they never had before January 1st of this year. If you have more questions on that or anything else related to the new contracts, check us out on the Car Legal Hotline. It's available from 9 to 12 and 1 to 4, Monday through Friday, and we always love hearing from you. Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you on the next edition of Legal Bites.